Passable.
Live from Toronto to the world.
Josh!
This is Josh Holiday Live. Talk that rocks.
The public needs to be informed.
Josh might surprise us.
Got an opinion? Dial 647-6YO-JOSH.
When you hear him, you're like, what?
Josh Holiday Live starts now.
I am very excited about this one. One of my all-time favorite humor writers is on the show. To say that Mike Sachs is a prolific comedy writer might even be an understatement. He has 9 books. He's written for Vanity Fair, Esquire, GQ, The New Yorker, Time Magazine, New York Times, The Washington Post, McSweeney's, Radar, Funny or Die, Mad Magazine, New York Observer, Premier, Believer, Vice, Maxim, Women's Health, and Salon. Worked at the Washington Post and is currently on the editorial staff of Vanity Fair. That's Mike Sachs, and he joined us for a very entertaining conversation. I haven't started reading the new book yet. It arrived basically the morning after I started Chuck Klosterman's 90s book, your book, Passing on the Right. My ups, my downs, my lefts, my rights, my wrongs in my career so far in this bizarre world of comedy. When I'm reading the Chuck Klosterman 90s book, it actually reminded me quite a bit of your book's Slouchers.
Yes, I was just going to say that's being released as an audiobook next month.
I think the easiest way to get through this is probably chronologically. The first book I read of yours was, and here's the kicker, because I've always been interested in comedy and comedy writing and the comedy scene. And you put out 2 books of a similar ilk. There was that one and then a follow-up, Poking a Dead Frog. I imagine that must have been an exciting experience because both of those books feature interviews with a really, really wide range of comedy writers, both old and new, and a lot of comedy greats. What was the experience of just putting that together for you?
Well, it was logistically very, very tough. I mean, I put out both of those books. Each of them took a year to write. And I was doing everything, setting up the interviews, everything except transcribing. But I'm trying to think of the right word here. There's so many people that I reached out to that I was just a huge fan of. So to talk to Bob Odenkirk, David Sedaris, Harold Ramis, Stephen Merchant, was just a huge thrill. And from a selfish standpoint, it was really just to say, all right, guys, you're incredibly successful. What would you recommend that I do or don't do? What would I avoid to achieve success as a comedy writer? And it really was just me wanting to pick their brains. And if anyone else wanted to read about it, I would have loved that. I mean, when I was growing up, there was very few interview books about comedy. There were books about SNL and Your Show of Shows and maybe MASH, and that was pretty much it. So I really wanted to reach out and put out something that might help those who were just coming up in comedy, and something I would have loved to have found. I always imagine myself skipping math class and going to the library and sort of stumbling on this book. I would have just been over the moon. So for that reason alone, it was great. And for another reason, I knew that a lot of these people, including Irv Brecker, who wrote for the Marx Brothers, and others were dying off. I mean, they were in their 80s and 90s, and I really did want to reach them before they passed away. And I'm really glad I did so because a few of them, including Harold Ramis, Larry Gelbart, did pass away afterwards, and they weren't that old. So it really was sort of a thrill and just something special that I got to interview the writer for Tootsie or the writer for Bob Hope or the writer for the Marx Brothers. I mean, that world means so much to me, and that bridge to that time is just gone now.
Well, and what an opportunity. And I look at it as kind of a genius move. It's like enrolling yourself in a personal masterclass of having all of these professors, and you get to ask them everything you want. I feel this, like years and years ago, I covered a film for radio, and I covered a lot of the film festivals, and I was always amazed to be able to sit with these directors of these movies, the basic storytellers, and have a one-on-one with them. And I thought, this is better than any kind of film school. You're basically having a private lesson from these people. So that must have been a great experience. And I'm sure, especially as you've moved forward from that, a lot of that is probably sunk in and improved your work.
Oh, completely. I mean, there's no better way, in my view, to get information and advice than to go to someone who has made it and to let them tell you, they're the star of the interview. It shouldn't be me. And I really did try to stay in the background for these interviews. And it's in their words. It's not me writing an article with a few quotes in them. I mean, the piece itself is them telling the reader what to do and what not to do. And I just didn't see that out there at the time, especially when I put out the first book. And in fact, it had a hard time getting published. I mean, it was rejected by like 20 publishers. It didn't exist, I don't think. Now, there's a lot of books and there's a lot of podcasts and there's a lot of sites that interview comedy writers. But at that time, it just sort of didn't exist. And I just didn't understand why it didn't exist. And in retrospect, I am very glad I put it out. I mean, it took a lot of time and it was tough. And I don't know if I'll do another book, but I am glad that I did those two.
Well, they're both pretty comprehensive volumes of you leave very few stones unturned in terms of who you talk to over the two books. Who, if you had to pick some favorites from either of the two books, who do you think stands out as someone who really maybe surprised you or excited you?
Well, the one I loved the most was someone named Peg Lynch. And what I was doing was I wanted to talk to writers for radio, and I knew a lot of them had died off. So I reached out to a specialist in early 30s, 40s, 50s radio comedy. And I asked, are there any writers out there still alive who did this? And he gave me a list of like 10 to 15. And I went through the list, tried to reach out, and did research. And I found they had all passed away, except for one. And her name was Peg Lynch. And she basically invented the modern comedy. She had a very, very naturalistic radio show in the 30s and 40s that she wrote all herself. She wrote like 200 scripts. And it was just sort of like finding an oyster in the bottom. It was just like finding gold. I called up the town where she lived, which I knew she lived in Massachusetts in a specific town. Called up the town council and I said, "You don't know a Margaret Lynch, do you?" She goes, "Oh, Peg Lynch, yeah, here's her number." Gave me her number. I ended up calling, and we ended up talking that first time. She didn't know me from Adam. She ended up talking to me for like an hour, and then I set up another date and we talked some more. But by doing research on her, it just kept getting deeper, and I just couldn't believe what she had accomplished. This was a woman who was 96 when I talked to her. She grew up in Minnesota. Her mom was a nurse for the Mayo Clinic. And a lot of celebrities who were sick would come through to be diagnosed. And as a 13 or 14-year-old, Peg was the last person to ever interview Lou Gehrig, who was at the Mayo Clinic being diagnosed with ALS. And she interviewed him for the local radio show, which I just found. I mean, she also interviewed Newt Rockney, the coach of Notre Dame. Just an amazing backstory. And the fact that she had created decades before Seinfeld, a show about nothing, just sort of blew me away. And it was, in a sense, kind of sad because no one had really reached out to her in years. And I think she was happy to talk about her career and comedy and what it meant to her. And she was very, very modest, but she really did achieve a lot. And I think she did want the world to sort of come to it and come to the work. And that to me was really like, all right, this is what it's about, because it's such a rare thing for that to happen. And the fact that she turned out to be such an amazing interview and then shortly passed away after it was published, I just feel very, very blessed to have talked to her and to have picked her brain about comedy, because she was a forerunner, way ahead of her time. Way years before anything. And I think she has just been forgotten. And it's just sort of sad. The show she created was first a radio show, then a TV show. It was called Ethel and Albert. And look it up. It's on YouTube. You can find clips in certain shows, but I think your listeners will enjoy it.
Well, I think it's especially amazing when you think of the time period she did it in, where, you know, women had to really, really fight, and even to this day, continue to fight, and to have done so much in a wholly different era is pretty amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, the strength of character it took for her to do this was astonishing. And just like you could sense that power, even at 96, like you could sense this strong woman who knew that she was talented and knew that she should be out there competing with men, and nothing was going to hold her back. I'm surprised no one's made a biopic about her, quite frankly, because her life is just fascinating.
Maybe they'll option that chapter from your book.
I hope so. I mean, she is, I think, you know, there's a lot of amazing young women in comedy now as stand-ups and writers. I think they should know about her, because it's almost like knowing about Babe Ruth. If you're a ball player now, you have to know what came before. I think that will make your comedy that much richer. And I don't know if her name is as well known as it should be.
No, well, it doesn't. You don't hear it a lot, I guess is a way to put it. So those two books were about other people for the most part, and you curated that collection. But you're also a pretty prolific writer of humor. And when I try to explain to people what you write, it's really a challenge, because it's sort of a little bit complicated. It's not straightforward. There's a couple of books you've written that are sort of like genre books. They're based on a specific genre of film or an era of film and television, and you sort of parody it, sort of pay tribute to the era. One of them is Stinker Lets Loose, which is a parody or a tribute to an era that I think there's a lot of people who will hear this and may not get what it's based on, because there's a time in the 70s where there was a television show about a truck driver who had a sidekick who was a monkey, and that was a popular television show. And
it's for a very specific age set. I mean, when I tell certain people who are younger, including my daughter, about this, they think I'm talking like out of my ass. But there was a few years in America where truckers ruled the kingdom. It was a very Southern pop culture back then. Jimmy Carter was the president. And those movies at the time, I would say 3-year period, Smokey and the Bandit, Hooper, all those movies that had to do with a simple man from the South fighting the system. I mean, this was all post-Watergate. That meant a lot to me, these movies, because I grew up with it. If you didn't grow up with it, it probably means nothing. But it was a thing, and it did exist, and it had never really been tackled from a satirical standpoint. So I thought it would be fun to do. But you mentioned something a little earlier that I was just talking to somebody about. These are really hard books to describe, and I'm wondering if they're too hard to describe, because they seem to confuse the shit out of people.
Well, I think if you get it, you get it. But I think if it's someone who's maybe new to it, it's a little bit harder. Like even a couple of minutes ago, I was in the park, and I was trying to explain to someone what books you've written, and so I was trying to, for some of them, they're written as nonfiction style, written by fictional authors. There's a couple of those, and then the others are more sort of genre pieces written in the style of more cinematic or television type themes. So it definitely is hard. And then obviously the newest one, we will talk about it. We'll get to that. But it's another one where it's fictional. It's a fictional author writing a nonfiction book that's not real. It is tough to describe.
Well, they're fake found items. I like to say that they exist within their own world, and if you picked it up and didn't know I wrote it, they could very well have existed. In fact, until my father passed away, he thought that Stinker Lets Loose was a real movie. I mean, nothing I could tell him could convince him that I made it up. And I thought, if I'm confusing my father to this degree, what the fuck am I doing to the rest of the public?
Well, even the way it's presented, it looks like a paperback you might find at a truck stop or in sort of the remainders bin, and it like there's no real hint that it could be a parody unless you knew, because the author is this fictional character, and it's based on the 40th anniversary of a movie that doesn't exist. So it is, but I never put two and two together in terms of you writing that book. And then I was like, oh, that's the same guy who did, and Here's the Kicker and Poking a Dead Frog. And then I was like, I loved it. Basically what happened, how I discovered your fiction stuff is, I'm always looking for great comedy writing. And it's really hard to find. Who are some of the ones that you consider kind of top-notch comedy writers, if you had to name a few?
Well, everyone I reached out to, I was a fan of, and I reached out to a lot, and I would say half made the books. In many cases, you need sort of an ego to talk about yourself, and in many cases, if the interview didn't work out, it was just them being so modest that they didn't really want to talk about themselves. But yeah, everyone I interviewed and was really people I loved, and in quite a few cases, I've become quite friendly with them, which is really kind of a dream come true, because these are people I grew up reading, whether it was David Sedaris, Meryl Marco, who created...
I love her.
I mean, she's a genius.
I've read all her books, too. She's...
I mean, all these people, they're all so nice. Roz Chast, I mean, all these people are brilliant and nice. And that combination I love, because if you're an asshole, and I have interviewed a few assholes, I don't want to deal with you. I really don't. I don't care how good you are as a writer. You need to be kind of a mensch. And I think that is what comedy writers need to be if they want to be successful. Not only dealing with people, but also getting out comedy that is good comedy and going after the right people. Not hitting those who are beneath you, which I've seen quite a bit. And to me, that's the best comedy. Decent humor, character-driven, and that's the humor that will last.
Talking about Stinker Lets Loose, something that evolved from that was an actual Audible project where it was made into essentially theater of the mind, if you will, kind of a throwback. When I was reading it, I thought, wow, this is great. This is really cinematic, but to make it really well as a movie, it would cost so much money. So I thought it was a brilliant idea to do it as an audio thing. I imagine you could have done it animated or just done the audio. So tell me about the Audible version of Stinker Lets Loose.
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I want to go back a little bit.
Sure.
Because when I decided to write that book, it was sort of a schism in my life. I was getting separated, and it was a very bad time. I was drinking a lot, and I had been writing a lot for magazines and books, but it really wasn't what I wanted to write. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to write what I want to write, and I don't care if 5 people read it or 10 people read it. It's going to be bizarre, I guess, but it's something that I want on the shelf. And that was a novelization to a non-existent movie from the 70s. In this case, the movie would have been called Stinker Lets Loose. So I wrote this book in maybe 6 to 8 months and put it out there. By put it out there, I mean I self-published it. I had it designed by a professional designer, and it was on Amazon, and I sent out an email. And about a week later, someone got in touch with me named Eric Martin. He's a voiceover artist and producer, and he said, I would love to have the rights of this to put this out as an audio. And I said, yeah, sure, that's fine. He goes, but I can't pay you any money. I said, that's okay. I don't imagine there's going to be a long line for this one. And he, within weeks, got John Hamm to play Stinker, got Paul F. Tompkins, Andy Richter, Ray Seahorn from Better Call Saul, play the girlfriend, Joe DiMaggio, an amazing cast that really brought to life this thing that I created. And it was really an interesting lesson because I didn't make any money. No one was paying me to write this book, but I wanted something out there that I was happy with. And I found that when you put out something that you like, good things tend to happen. And if it exists, it's a lot easier to show someone and explain it than if something doesn't exist. So I could have pitched that book for years and no one would have understood it. I mean, they don't understand it as it stands. But the fact that John Hamm would want to play this trucker character because the book existed, it just meant so much to me. And listening to that audio production, which I think is fantastic, and then listening to the soundtrack, there's a soundtrack based on that non-existent movie, with really professional musicians, studio musicians. Like this whole world came together all because I just wanted to do something new. And naturally what I've been trying to do ever since is just put out books. It's almost like a character actor would play a role. I'm playing a role writing these books. In that case, it was sort of a middling author of novelizations. In this current case, it's a mediocre comedian who made it big in the conservative world. So it's just like playing roles. And when you put out something, good things tend to happen. And that is what I try to tell people who are just starting off or asking for advice. I really do think in comedy especially, you have to put out what you want, how you want to do it. And you really can't wait for someone to give you permission.
That holds true not just of writing, but especially now, and you've seen it a lot with a lot of sketch comedy and people putting out videos that normally you would have to hire a big film crew and it would be very expensive and hard to make. You would usually have to pitch it to someone before it got made, but now people are making it and bouncing from there. So it definitely is a show me situation now.
Well, it really is. And I think the opportunity has never existed like it has now. I mean, the fact that I could put out a book and put it up on Amazon and potentially sell as many copies as I would with a traditional publisher, it just never existed in the history of humankind. And for comedians now and sketch artists, like, you can put out your stuff and be seen. When I was first starting off, you could not do that. I mean, this is a tremendous opportunity to put out whatever you want and be discovered for what you want out there. You don't have to play the game of writing something or performing in something that you don't want to be in. So I think that's just unheard of, really. I mean, it just has never existed before. And I sort of envy those who are coming up now. The competition is fierce. There's never been more people in comedy. But you can certainly do what you want to do and get it out there. And people can watch it, read it, just like they would for anything else.
So that was Stinker Lets Loose, which was a novel based on a fictional movie. The next project that came out in 2018 was Randy. That's the first one I came to via Vulture end of year list. I got it and I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is great. And then I went back to Stinker. But if you had to tell someone what Randy the book was about, how would you describe it?
Right. Well, it's excuse me. They're all confusing, but this one's especially a little confusing. All right. So I always wanted to write a book of, in Italy, and I guess it was the 15th or 14th century. If you were an artist, you were sponsored by a rich family, say in Medici's, and by being sponsored, you would then have to portray that family in a positive light. Painting them in a flowery way or talking nicely in poetry about them. So I wanted to do that for a modern day character. And I also wanted to deal with what I saw at that time as being a lot of supporters for Trump, and also libertarians and people I grew up with in Maryland. So he's a 30-something guy named Randy. He lives at the top of a hill in a development that he put together after he inherited his grandmother's farm and turned into a suburban development. And he's sort of the king of the development. He's in charge of all the rules. He's in charge of this little world. And he's really completely delusional. He's not nearly as clever or as inventive or as funny as he thinks he is. So that combination of someone coming in and writing about this guy in very flowery prose. The author is being paid by Randy and given a free place to stay for a year. That combination of a horrible character where you know that even that this guy is writing about it in a very positive way, you can tell that he despises this guy, and this guy's a total loser. So that was sort of the combination I wanted to go with that one.
And you went on a bit of a run here. 2017, Stinker Let's Lose, 2018, Randy, and then 2019, 2 different books. One, Passable in Pink, which is basically I saw it as a bit of a John Hughes-inspired tribute/parody. Can you describe that one?
Yeah, that was, I wanted to, after the 70s novelization, I wanted to do a novelization per decade. So I wanted to do the 80s next. And for me, coming up when I was just a kid, John Hughes movies meant a lot to me. But I tried showing these to my daughter, who's 12, and it didn't connect, let's just say. And I thought it was very interesting that in a matter of 30 years or so, they seem slow and they seem dated and inappropriate in a lot of ways. So I sort of wanted to take on that type of style from the 80s within looking at it in the present day way and seeing what has aged well and what hasn't aged well. And that was another case of putting out the book and it becoming an audiobook with just a great cast. I mean, Ray Seahorn was involved again. Bob Odenkirk was in it. Justine Bateman was in it. And the actor from Breakfast Club, Judd Nelson, was in it. Gillian Jacobs. So Adam Scott played the main character. So it was just really, really fun to do. And what you say is completely true. I mean, I can't make a movie, but I can create a fake movie that can then be put into audio. So it's almost like a throwback to the 40s or 50s where you create these worlds that are very, very doable. That wouldn't be doable otherwise.
No, and I think you certainly there used to be a time where radio drama was pretty big. Well, initially that was mostly what radio was, and then over the years it's kind of been stripped back, and now it's either people jabbering or music. But with the audiobooks and podcasting has opened up a new venue for these types of projects, which is pretty amazing.
It is amazing, and it sort of surprised me by how popular it became again, because there's so much available at our fingertips, but there's something magical really about listening to an audio production. It just brings you into another world. And it also enables you to multitask. I mean, you can clean and do other things while listening to this story. I find it amazing and exciting really for writers because it's purely a writer's medium. I mean, it all comes down to the writers. You really can't, well, that's not fair. I mean, the actors who read these lines are a huge part of it, as is the production. But it really is very writer friendly. And you can go into places that you wouldn't be able to get away with in normal movies. I mean, you can do anything. It's almost like animation. Yeah,
basically your budget is limitless. You can travel, you can go wherever you want because it's all
it's all there
in the mind.
Yeah.
So you mentioned doing the 70s, Stinker Let's Loose, the 80s, Passable in Pink. Also in 2019, Slouchers came out, and that's your 90s book, which from my perspective, I sort of saw it as a Slackers meets Singles with a little bit of reality bites in it.
Yeah, and this was the most personal book to me because this is when I was really coming of age, and these movies meant a lot. I mean, I'm up Gen X, and I watched a lot of these movies. And here again, there's the case of watching this movie now, 30 years later, and it just not holding up and looking just very, very silly, very self-important, very pompous. And I really wanted to prick that specific time period because that was when I was beginning to become an adult. And, I was working in retail, I was working in a record store, and it was just fun to go back to that time. But again, it's such a specific time period that means absolutely nothing if you didn't come up in it. I mean, that period, those movies mean nothing to my daughter or to her friends. It's like a science fiction movie.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I mentioned earlier in the interview reading Chuck Klosterman's 90s book, a nonfiction essay book. It almost feels like a companion piece. Maybe reading the Klosterman one to kind of get you back into that 90s vibe and hitting on all the touchstones, and then reading Slouchers, you'll have all the reference points.
It's so funny because I didn't even know that book was coming out, his book. And I had set up so that the audio production would be out next month. So it sort of does overlap. I can't wait to read that book. He's just an amazing writer. He knows that time period really, really well. I mean, there's so many details that if you didn't grow up then, you just wouldn't know. And I tried to get all of those details into this fake Gen X movie. I think it was supposed to have come out in 92 or 93. Oh, actually, it was just as Nirvana's Nevermind video, just before that came out.
Yeah, the Klosterman, right? They're right in the first couple of chapters. There's a whole big piece on how that sort of kicked off essentially the 90s, even though it was a couple of years into the 90s. That video, that song, kind of kicked everything into gear.
Yeah,
I want
to read it. Is it a good book so far?
So far, so good. Yeah, I'm a couple of chapters in, and I like what he writes. Ever since Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, especially his essayist stuff. And this is perfect because, again, I think we're sort of the same, where the 90s was our 20s essentially. And
it really rings true for a certain type.
I'm going to sidetrack for 1 second because I remember I don't know if it was in Passable in Pink or Slouchers, but there was a reference to, there's a Chris Elliott reference, and I remember asking you on I think Instagram or one of the services. I was like, is that a Chris Elliott reference? And it was, and I have to say that's Chris Elliott is one of my favorites of all time. I love.
What was the
Chris.
reference? Do you remember?
I can't recall. I can't. It may have been Passable in Pink, but it was maybe about Chris Peterson, or I think it was a Get a Life reference.
Well, see, Chris Elliott to me is everything. I mean, everything that I write is basically an author version of those characters he did on Late Night, where he would come out, pretend to play these characters, but not to the degree where you didn't know it was him. And he knew it was him, and Letterman knew it was him, but he still tried to get off with these characters, which were as half frightening as they were funny. So to me, these characters that I take on when I write these books, they're just Chris Elliott. I mean, to me, everything sensibility-wise that I got into in comedy has come from Chris Elliott.
Yeah, I love his Letterman appearances were amazing, and I became obsessed with Get a Life. I would tell everyone about it, and it seemed to be one of those shows that you either really, really loved it or you thought it was really, really stupid. And
that's another guy, Adam Resnick, who co-created that with Chris Elliott.
His book's great too.
Oh my God, he's the best. And I interviewed him for the first book, I think, and we've become friends, which is just amazing. And the stories that he tells me about the making of that show, and then Cabin Boy, and working on Letterman, it's like that's everything to me, because that really influenced me comedically, sensibility wise. Letterman, the show itself was amazing, but very specifically, it was Chris Elliott when he was on that show.
Well, I love that YouTube's putting up a lot of the old. Well, Letterman started a channel there and putting up a lot of the old Letterman stuff where it was really just kind of fun television.
Well, that's based off. That all comes from one person's collection, and he taped every show.
Wow!
Because NBC is not in any rush to put it out there because Letterman kind of screwed them over. Mm-hmm. So if it wasn't for this one guy, this stuff would not exist.
I graduated, basically my last year or two of university was when Get a Life was huge, and I was obsessed with it. And then after I finished university, I went to California on some kind of exchange visa or something. And I was on the 3rd Street Promenade, and there was the little comedy club there. And there's a guy just sort of sitting outside, and I started chatting with him about the comedy show, and I told him I like Get a Life, and he's like, oh, I actually write on that. And then so it turned out back in '93 it was Bob Odenkirk.
Holy shit! Look at that.
Yeah. So it was really, it was really strange. It was like, oh my God, you're yeah. And this is sort of
wow.
At that point, no one essentially knew who Bob Odenkirk was.
Wow. Yeah.
And he was very, very generous. He would do a show there pretty much every week. Him and Andy Dick would do a show in this tiny little venue, and befriended him, and he was sort of, when I lived in LA, he was sort of a mentor. When I hang out with him and his wife.
He's the greatest guy.
And he's a sweet guy, super
person.
sweet. Yeah.
And he's someone, too, that I was hugely influenced by and became friendly with. Now, he's everything you need to do in comedy. You produce what you want to do, and you can't really care what other things. You work at the top of your intelligence, and you're just incredibly nice. And he hits all of those points. He's just a special guy.
And kindness, I think, kindness is something that
it goes so far, really. There's so many assholes out there.
This
but
is
to
true.
be nice and to take a moment to mentor someone like he did with you, I mean, it must have meant a tremendous amount, right? And to this day.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It was, I think I have really, really good memories. So you mentioned Slouchers, the audio version is coming out. In what form will that take? That's
going to be Eric Martin. He was involved with the narration for Stinker Lets Loose. He's going to be reading all the roles.
Okay.
I tried to sell it to Audible. They've moved on. They're in a whole new territory. The people who used to produce my books have since left. So it was a tougher sell. But he's putting it out, and it should be really good. And he's dead on.
So the newest book got a long title, Passing on the Right, My Ups, My Downs, My Lefts, My Rights, My Wrongs, and My Career so far in this bizarre world of comedy, the Skippy Battison story. Can you just try and encapsulate what this book is?
Yeah, first of all, the subtitle is purposely bad, as is everything. This is just a book of total mediocrity. It's... Fast Company reviewed it and said Skippy was a meteor of mediocrity, which I thought was brilliant. Mm-hmm. It's just a guy, he's a comedian, who fails throughout his entire career and sort of stumbles upon a winning formula, which is to become conservative and start his own podcast and then satellite radio show. And he soon becomes very popular and ultimately ends up leading the charge at the January 6th. He doesn't refer to it as an insurrection, but that's what he does. And is arrested in Nancy Pelosi's office for doing something inappropriate. But what I wanted to do really with this is just sort of mock the horribly written memoirs written by comedians, especially conservative comedians, and also go after a real mediocrity in the world of comedy, someone just very entitled, who does everything, writes for TV, writes for the movies, does everything, but doesn't do any of it well, and just sort of pays his way into success. And he really is a DC type character. I grew up outside DC. He goes to the same school Brett Kavanaugh went to. I had friends that went to that school. I went to a public school, but that was a private school. So it's just, again, it's another book. It's just everything I hate about America, basically, but very specifically in the comedic scene. And it really is everything that you read in the books that I advise you to do in the interview books. He does the opposite. So it's like an X-ray version of Poking a Dead Frog. He's just someone you do not want to emulate. He's just the worst person in comedy.
Well, and it's funny. I've talked about this before, but it's really, really hard to find anyone who is legitimately conservative and actually funny. It feels like there were people who used to be funny and then they became conservative and they're not funny. Although I believe the character in this book never started out as especially funny, but
no, he was never funny. But he found his way into that world. But you're right. I don't know of any conservative comedians or very few comedy writers who are conservative. There are a few libertarians. But most people are liberal or Democrats or reasonable comedy writers for a reason. And that is you go after those who are in positions of power. You're not one of those who are in position of power. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've noticed recently is that you have comedy that goes after the wrong people, that goes after science, that goes after truth. And it's very negative. I'll I'll see clips of these so-called humorist bits from Fox News, and it's just very negative and very hurtful. You have these this guy, I forget his name, Jesse something. He'll go to various, or he used to go to
Jesse Waters. I think he used to be sort of Bill O'Reilly's.
Exactly. I mean, there's clips of him going to Penn Station in New York City and mocking homeless people. Clips of him going to Chinatown in New York and making fun of accents or the fact that it was karate, they're doing karate or gong sound. I mean, it's just really stupid shit. And the fact that he does this, I mean, stupid shit has always been done. What is new, I think, which I've never seen before, is a need for people to want to watch such a thing and to find it funny. There's not an ounce of cleverness in it. But the fact that millions would watch him go to Penn Station and make fun of the homeless, that to me is a new thing. And that I find very frightening.
Well, punching down has never been that funny. And most comedy is punching up, and punching down has always been frowned upon. But it seems like a lot of these conservative, quote, comedians, unquote, are using that as their main source of comedy.
Well, no comedy that's going to last is going to punch down. I mean, anything you read, whether it's 10 years ago, 100 or 2,000 years ago, Aristophanes, it's not punching down. It's always taking on those in power and having your lodestar aimed towards decency. And I've never seen, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to even see something like this, that you would watch comedy that would make fun of, I mean, in the past, comedians would go out there and raise money for the homeless. Now this idiot is out there with a camera crew in tow, not helping them, but videotaping and making jokes about how much they smell. Like, that comedy cannot last. And the fact that it has any audience, let alone the millions that it has, I find terrifying.
Yeah, well, and same thing with the Greg Gutfeld show.
Terrible.
Which, you, like, as someone who enjoys comedy, if you watch it, you wonder, like, how could anyone watch it and find it amusing? But then you see that it actually is one of Fox's better rated shows, and it's just baffling.
Well, it's that in particular, there's no reason why a conservative daily show wouldn't work. And it's been tried many times. It just doesn't work. It doesn't connect, and it never will. But watching that show is just, they go after the libs, and they go after experts, and they go after this, and they go after that. I'm hoping that a show like this won't last. I'm hoping that a Jesse Waters won't last, because I can't imagine future generations wanting to watch this shit. I mean, who wants to watch it now, let alone 20, 50, 100 years from now? It's just, I find it very odd.
Yeah, it's definitely garbage. Have you, I know the book just arrived this week. Well, for me it did anyway. Maybe in the States it came out a little bit sooner, but have you put any thought into what the audio version will take of this one, or is it still too early?
No, I'm recording it now. I'm actually in the last chapter. I'm playing Skippy.
Oh, nice.
And it's just me in my room ranting. There's been a few times where my daughter has knocked on the door and asked if I was okay. I feel like a lunatic in there. But it's just going to be me reading the book. What I would like, I mean, there's a whole world one can open this up to. And in the book, he mentions that there are famous actors and comedians who get together and read, ironically, his shit movie scripts. I think it would be fun to actually do that, to write a fake movie script and to have these actors read it as if it were real.
That's great. And so just in terms of process, so when you're doing the audio version of it, do you stick very specifically to what you've written for the print version, or can you play with it a little and go off script?
Oh, I'm always going off script, usually because I can't pronounce words, or I have, certain things I pronounce incorrectly. So I'm always adding something here and there. It's I would say 95% based off of the book, but there's, other things you can do that I haven't seen done with audiobooks, which is sort of like make a world behind the world. And the joke in the book was that he had to self-publish because Viking canceled it after the January 6th insurrection. And the joke with the audiobook is that he has to do it himself too. Uh-huh. So there's a lot of there's a lot of like animals making noises, and of course all of his pets are named after conservative heroes. So I try to get some in-jokes in about that too. But it's just it's not an audio production as much as just me reading this very long book, 460 pages, I think it is.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's much heavier than Stinker.
Well, I gave it to David Sedaris, who's a friend, and he liked it, but he said, this is a lot to read for a character who's a real asshole. And I thought, yeah, you're right. But for someone like this, this is what he would put out. He can't put out anything that would be slim. I mean,
no.
in his mind, he is the greatest thing ever. So of course, this book has to be the length of like a Winston Churchill.
I follow your Instagram, and I love it because I get the sense that you spend a lot of time in used bookstores, scouring the bargain bins in the shelves, because there's always amazing, not just book covers. Sometimes you show some inside stuff, and I also imagine that it sort of inspires a lot of your work.
Well, it definitely does. I mean, I always recommend to any young writers to go where others aren't, and to look where others aren't. There's nothing really to be found necessarily in a Barnes & Noble that anyone else isn't going to find. You really do have to go digging deeper into the corners, whether it's flea markets or used bookstores or what have you. That's where I find the most fascinating things that no one really even knows exists anymore. And to me, it's almost like a mythological world. It's like when Bob Dylan, his character in the 60s was sort of based off of these roaming American ideal of a troubadour and a newsman. To me, this is mythology. I mean, the real novelizations that I find, the real pop culture books, the real esoterica, to me is very America. And I like sort of playing into that and sort of creating fake versions of that, because this really was my history as an American pop culture. And I think it's a very rich vein that isn't always being looked into. And there's just a lot of opportunity to make fun of, not just to make fun, but to sort of poke fun at what existed, but in the present day's viewpoint, and to make a point about where we were and where we are now. In Stinker, there's a lot of references to there not being many minority characters. I mean, if you go back to these films, there's no African Americans, no Asian, except to be made fun of. So you can sort of make fun of the ignorance of it within the present day, while also sort of remaining true to what it was and what brought laughs and grins and joy to those at the time.
So when you see these books, do you bring them home, or do you just take a picture?
Well, it depends how expensive. I mean, if it's expensive, I'll just take a picture. But I don't want any books that I don't want to read. So if it doesn't look like anything beyond the cover is going to be interesting, I won't take it home. I'll just take a photo of it there. But it's not just pop culture. It's esoterica. It's UFO.
Oh, yeah. There's all kinds of great ones.
Yeah. Cults, Bigfoot. I just love that stuff. I don't know why.
I almost think it's almost coffee book table worthy. I in the back of my mind, I'm like, put this out as a coffee table book. I would definitely.
Oh, that's actually
that.
Funny. Yeah, because I have some coffee table books of old jazz record covers, and I know there's a book out there of old horror books from the 70s and 80s, which is amazing. But I don't even know if this falls into any one category. It's just esoterica bizarreness, and there was a lot of bizarreness back then. I mean, there is now. But to put out a book then took some effort. And if you're willing to write a book about Bigfoot in the 70s, it wasn't easy. It took some time.
No, and I think we'll probably see less and less of those books in bookstores as people can self-publish on demand, so it won't get made unless someone orders one. Whereas before you would print a whole bunch and put them out there and see what happened.
Right. Well, you see less, but you also see more of this bizarreness in the real world. I mean, I see a lot of crazy conspiracy theory books that came out in the 60s and 70s that are just being repeated verbatim now by politicians in the goddamn Capitol. Yeah. So on the one hand, it's disappearing. On the other hand, it made the mainstream. I mean, just bizarre shit.
Tell me a bit about 2022. There's reprints of Stinker Lets Loose and Randy. Will there be any differences from the originals to the new ones?
Yeah, each of them have different additional chapters material. and new design.
Okay. And then Woodmont, A College Guide. What's that all about?
Yeah, that is a fake college catalog of a very, very pricey boutique mediocre college, fictional, that I co-wrote with a friend of mine who wrote for The Onion for many years, Jason Roeder. And I actually read from that. I opened for David Sedaris at some cities this fall, and I read from that book as a fake character of a representative of this fake college.
Oh, nice.
But the book is really sort of going after the catalog, going after those catalogs that I used to receive, and I guess kids still do, but via PDF, of a very flowery type of look at a very pricey school that may not be top tier.
It feels sort of like the National Lampoon would put out yearbooks and in that vein, and I always found them quite funny.
Well, that's exactly what it is, and that's the stuff I grew up loving. I mean, I came in way after that, but like High School Yearbook by National Lampoon meant a tremendous amount, and that stuff really isn't being done anymore.
No.
It's just not out there. And I thought that it would be fun. Actually, a few years ago, a great group, Casper Hauser, comedy writing group, put out a fake in-flight magazine in which you could buy various products. And it was just absolutely brilliant. But since then, I don't know of anything that has been a parody of something very specific. And it's just something I missed. I liked reading them growing up, and I hope that people will like reading it now. It's just like it looks exactly like a college guide, and if you didn't know it was fake, you would perhaps think it was actually a very real college that just happens to cost $120,000 a year.
So tell me a little bit about the podcast that you do. I just became aware of it as I was reading this show. I've read pretty much everything you've written in terms of books, but I imagine it's sort of just a passion project in a lot of ways. You combine interviews with people who you enjoy, and then there's some more almost like found books, found footage as well. What can you tell me about the podcast?
Yeah, the podcast was, speaking of National Lampoon, I wanted it to be like a National Lampoon radio hour, which was a radio show that they had in the early 70s, and then they also put out comedy albums. So for about a year and a half, 2 years, I put out this podcast with my friend Rob Schulte, in which there would be bits, not necessarily sketches, but just funny little bits, and then found the sound audio, like Casey Kasem cursing or Larry King on the air drunk, that sort of thing. And then also interviews with people I really, really admired, whether it was Vince Gilligan of Better Call Saul, or Breaking Bad, or Bill Hader, or Ray Seahorn, or David Sedaris. Now, I put that on pause and really haven't come back to it because I've just been concentrating on books. But I sort of miss attacking things from that audio angle where I could just put up. But now the problem too is that, as you know, there's a lot of competition out there.
Oh, for sure.
To do all this for free, which what I was doing, it was just too much work. So I just sort of put it on hold for a while. But I really do like the episodes that we did manage to put out.
Yeah, I remember there were some great CDs. I think the guy's name was Nick or something, and it was all kind of outtakes. There was the Orson Welles and I
love that stuff. I love it.
Ernie Anderson coming up.
Yeah, Tommy Lasorda cursing.
Yeah,
all that stuff.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
That was really the internet pre-internet. We used to trade around tapes of that, bootleg tapes.
Yes.
Of those little clips. That was really YouTube, pre-YouTube.
Have you watched TV Carnage?
No.
Oh, I think you would enjoy it. It's a guy, a Canadian guy. I think he's in the States now, but it's basically about 4 or 5 DVDs, and I think you can actually download the video now too. But it's basically garbage TV that he's compiled and put on these discs.
I have these on DVD. Sorry, yeah, I own these on DVD.
Oh, good, yeah, same. Like Ouch, Television Attacks, and
yes,
yeah.
And there is a duo.
The Found Footage Festival?
I love those guys.
Those are great too.
Oh my God. And then their podcasts every Tuesday. And those guys are brilliant. So that's the stuff that I used to be doing.
Yeah.
But they've dedicated their careers to it. And the stuff that they find is just astonishing.
Yeah. Like the garage, I imagine many garage sales have those types of things.
Oh my God. And they're actually doing a huge service to Pop Americana because this stuff would be, I guarantee you wouldn't find any of this shit anywhere else. But I think there's a place for it because it's at this point history, and it says a lot, even if it's poorly done, about that time and what the zeitgeist was in America when a certain video was produced.
Yeah, well, definitely, you watch it, you get a sense of the time, and it, yeah, it's definitely an artifact. You wouldn't necessarily think of it as academic, but it's definitely an artifact of media history that tells a lot.
It tells so much. I mean, there's so much that you can read into it. And those years are lost. And this is before it was easy to record. And now everything is recorded. So there was a lot that's been lost. And they have managed. I mean, it almost reminds me of, the people who would travel the South in the 40s and 50s and collect these old 78s, which would have disappeared otherwise. They're scrounging around and they're finding these things that I think really do have a use and an importance for writers and pop culture historians that just wouldn't be there otherwise. And to devote their careers to it, I just find that incredible.
Yeah, it's great, and they've found a niche, and people definitely appreciate it. When is the college book come out?
That is coming out in May, and the same month actually as the re-release of Stinker and Randy, which will be through Simon & Schuster rather than self-published.
Yeah,
like it was the first time.
So we have the collector's editions.
Yes, you do keep those. It'll sure to be worth something.
Yes, huge value.
That's huge.
I really, really appreciate you coming on and having the chat, and maybe we'll check in again when the new releases come out.
This was so fun. I mean, you obviously know your stuff, and a lot of times when I'm interviewed, they're not really fans of comedy, but this was really fun, this back and forth. I really appreciate you talking to me.
Turn on the lights, open the shades.
The show's over, but the conversation continues. On Twitter at Josh Holiday, on the web at joshholidaylive.com, and hear missed episodes on your favorite podcatcher. Talk that rocks. Josh Holiday Live.